Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Do you think that's where we are right now? Mary and Joanna and others with them approached the tomb the first day of the week with the spices and oils they would need to prepare the violently broken body of their beloved friend and teacher for burial. There is a lot in that moment as they approach the tomb worth our unpacking. On this Easter Sunday that falls at such a time as we are living, I find it particularly noteworthy that these women, followers of Jesus, were not despondent, grieving, deeply in shock, traumatized, yes, but despondent to the point of inaction, no. The men who were followers of Jesus at this stage of the story we're not really sure about, but who could blame them, really, if they were off somewhere, holed up in a barricaded room, afraid and reeling from the traumatic loss of their loved one. Maybe the men are, or maybe they're not, utterly despondent. But make note, friends, these women are not. They have important things to do. This is the particular nuance that brings the story of Jesus' resurrection to life for me this year. These women have invested their lives in a person and in the ways that person taught. They have committed their trust and their hope in the one who is now in the grave. All they've hoped for, all they have longed for and worked for, whatever all of that trust and investment was all about, is now lying in a tomb. So yes, they have been crushed. And yes, they are grieving so very deeply. And yes, their whole lives have been shattered, but there is also stuff to be done. They are not despondent to the point of inaction. And I wonder if that's where we are in the world today. History seems to be playing on a loop, doesn't it? Have you noticed that? I spent the first week after troops and tanks started pouring over the Ukrainian border wondering how it is possible that such an ego-fueled naked power grab could be taking place on such a large geopolitical scale in the year 2022. And I've spent the 6 weeks since lamenting the loss of life and the terror and the violence leveled against a people, and like you, I'm sure, feeling utterly helpless about it. Helpless because I'm so far away. Helpless because the power behind it all is so great. Helpless because I know we have learned these lessons already. But while these feelings of helplessness have a new character and new faces and stories over which to be draped, the core of these feelings of mine is not new. There are people much closer to where I am suffering indignity, hunger, violence, death. Many simply because they're people of color, or women, or transgender, or abled in a way different than most, or because their heritage in this land is older than that of Europeans. Those inequities and that indifference and that misery have been amplified by our struggle to cope with a pandemic that we now know will simply be an unwelcome companion in our lives. What I'm saying is, the stench of decay is all around us and in us. And it is traumatizing, depressing, frightening, irritating. But I wonder if we find ourselves where the women on their way to the tomb were. That is to say, grieving, but not quite despondent. Like those women, we've got stuff to do. And collectively, we're busy in all kinds of places and ways, getting food items together for folks who need it, showing up in the times and places where people are raising their voices for change to unjust public policy, advocating for and providing for LGBTQ+ young people, addressing our own internalized narratives of supremacy, making meals for folks occupied by illness, sending support to humanitarian crises, training up young ones to be kind and just in their ways, recycling, composting, and trying to be a little more compost neutral. There is a lot of stuff that needs doing. And there's a lot of stuff we've set our hands to. But do you think that we're like the women that day? Doing the things that need doing, the good things, the important things, and the necessary things, the things that make a difference in the world, but doing them all, knowing all the while that our ultimate hope is over there already in the grave? Are we just applying some spices? Are we just freshening up a body? Are we just greeting the stench of death with a nice potpourri? I know the question that I'm posing this morning is an existential one. It is to say, is the world we're in, this creaturely existence we're living, is it already doomed to ultimate failure? Was the writer of Ecclesiastes right? Is it all vanity? Are we here just to make what we can out of this existence and then make peace with the fact that we're powerless against the forces of evil and death? It is an existential question. But I think we feel it in the practical places in our lives too, do we not? On the way to the office, 8:30 a.m., any old Tuesday morning, travel mug of coffee already halfway to lukewarm, and wondering, is this thing I'm doing with my life really doing anything? Providing for the family, sure, but is what I'm doing, is who I am, really tipping the tide of the world at all? Or mid-afternoon, middle of the week, in the car with a kid or two or three, on the way to practice or rehearsal or club, and wondering, are they getting it? Are these young ones filling up from the inside with the stuff they need to take care of themselves and others around them? But also, are their lives rich and meaningful and joyful now? Will they be growing into a kinder, gentler, more equitable world, or do we just need to protect them from the world? Or some random day when an appointment happened to be available to talk to a professional, an attorney about a will, or a financial advisor about retirement, or a representative of a home about housing and continuation of care, even a funeral director or pastor about final wishes. Is everything in order? Do I have enough to see me through? Will the kids have enough? Have I done enough? Is anything different because I've been here? Or are we all just getting through our days? Is all of our coming and going adding up to something? Are we where the women were? Doing the things that need doing, all while knowing the fullness of our hope for ourselves and for the world is over there lying in the grave. if we find ourselves where the women were, that might not be such a bad thing. Because remember, that's the first word from those white-clad messengers of God in our reading this morning after they announced that Christ is risen. They said, "Don't you remember?" "Don't you remember," they said, "that He told you that the Son of Man had to be handed over to sinners and crucified? Don't you remember that He told you this day would come? Don't you remember He told you it would all seem futile? Don't you remember He told you you'd have to grieve? Don't you remember He told you there would be suffering and there would be wondering if any of it even matters? Don't you remember He told you there would be just going through the motions because you don't know what else to do? Don't you remember He told you there would be, I don't know what to do now? Don't you remember He told you there would be evil so staggering, so blatant, so militant, so violent that to even speak a word of challenge against it would be to invite pain unimaginable? And don't you remember He told you on the third day? Don't you remember? Don't you remember that He told you on the third day He would get up again? The women were there and ready to prepare a body for burial. But they were only there for that reason because they had forgotten what He said. Have we forgotten? I don't know that we've forgotten what He said. We do have, after all, this one day each year to celebrate what He told us about resurrection and the Alleluias and all of those things. You see? That right there is what's happened. Just like that. We gave you bells and told you to celebrate the fact that Christ arose on the third day by ringing them when you heard Alleluia. And that sounded like a good idea, so you did it with your full force and might. And then we did it a few more times, and that was fun. And then, it got to be kind of normalized, but we went through the motions anyway. Alleluia. Then for a little while we didn't ring the bells because we just in the service hadn't proclaimed Alleluia for a bit. And we didn't forget so much as we were just kind of out of practice. It caught us by surprise a moment ago. We started talking about some serious stuff, and jingling bells in the middle of all that seems to be a bit silly. Like the sound of the bells just doesn't have a lot to offer in the midst of talk about the darkness in our world. We didn't really forget the bells so much as we assigned them to their place. The bells proclaim the resurrection of Christ, and things like that don't have a place when things get real, do they? But then some guy clad in white said, "Remember?" And the bells came back. Alleluia. And that's just the way the life of faith works. We know and we proclaim that we are a people of resurrection. But of course, there's little evidence of resurrection in the world. In time, things get real. The decay of things catches our attention. The violence of the world stuns us, not into complete stillness, mind you, we're still doing the good things. We're still staying busy with serving and learning and growing and giving off as much goodness as we can. But the full reality of what we're doing kind of finds its way to the background. And before long, somewhere within us, we're no longer on our way to witness resurrection. We're just on our way to dressing a body. Those two things can sometimes look a lot the same, you know. Dressing a body and witnessing resurrection. But they aren't the same thing. One is to step into a world knowing it will defeat you, which is brave but unsustainable. The other is to know that only death will suffer defeat, which is final. One is to watch the news and shake one's head saying things will never change. The other is to go out and put a little change in the news. One is to greet the suffering in the world with random acts of do-gooderism. The other is to commit oneself fully and permanently to just outcomes and equitable experience for all. Remember, he said there would be struggle and fear and violence and pain, but on the third day he would get up. Remember, the resurrection of Christ has never been about a guy waking up from a 3-day nap 2,000 years ago, but about the power of God to put back together what is broken, to restore what is lost, to give life to what has died. Remember, the resurrection of Christ may be behind us, but it is also still before us. Remember, we're not just going through the motions here. We're participating in resurrection. Remember, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia.